If you have a big 401k, IRA, 403b, and you're worried about your looming future tax bill, there's a high likelihood that you've done a great job saving over the years, and it's not your fault that the IRS is not so patiently waiting to take anywhere from 30 to 40% of that money in taxes unless you start to do something about it. So today I'm here to expose everything you need to know about Roth conversions so that you can avoid getting crushed in taxes because you didn't know how to plan for it. My name is Matt Calcagno, and for the last 2 decades, my firm has helped hundreds of clients with investing, financial, and tax planning, and today I'll share our process we use for determining if Roth conversions are optimal for each client. But first, you need to understand why I assess every client situation for potential Roth conversions as a planning strategy. And that's because many of my clients, and you watching perhaps, you have a joint bank account with your spouse. Well, what your tax-deferred account, like a 401k, IRA, 403b, is basically a joint account with the IRS. You may see $2 million on your balance sheet, but in reality, not all that money is yours. The goal really of Roth conversions, and I'm going to echo this for the entire video, is to pay the tax at a rate we believe to be the lowest based on what you will pay in the future. Because if you own a large tax-deferred account, taxes are not going to be an option. But what is in your control, not if you will pay, it's how and when you'll pay those taxes and at what rate you will pay those taxes. So we need to understand what are the critical reasons to even consider Roth conversions, because you'll read hundreds of articles talking about all these different rules of thumb, but the reality is that many of those rules of thumb just don't apply to the current tax environment today. And I believe a lot of these rules of thumb came before we had great technology and before we could do these on a case-by-case analysis for each person's tax situation, and I'm going to show you this. So let's go through each one of these reasons. The first critical reason to consider Roth conversions, and many of you know this, but the IRS, again, is not so patiently waiting to take anywhere from 30 to 40% of your account in taxes because of required minimum distributions. And these are essentially the ghost of Christmas future, which means if we don't draw down some of the balances, then we might get killed in taxes in the future because our taxable income will be too high as your accounts have grown over time. And I'll show you how that looks like with this case study, but Roth conversions can decrease your pre-tax balance and decrease your future RMD bill. And then number 2, doing Roth conversions early can keep your taxable income low enough to avoid losing some of those AGI-dependent tax deductions in the future. And of course, one of the common ones is Medicare IRMA. This is one of those tax gotchas in the tax code. What happens is when you're Medicare, you get the same coverage as your neighbor, but you might be paying a lot more in premiums because those tax-deferred balances are spitting out more income than you actually want due to RMDs. And number 3, it can help reduce your overall lifetime tax burden. And I'm going to show you how doing some targeted Roth conversions can save clients net over their lifetimes. Again, the idea is to pay taxes at your lowest lifetime option. And you'll see by how modeling out your income, there can be significant net lifetime savings when you actually run the numbers. Next, another critical reason is to take advantage of a down market. It's a common myth that if you're in a high tax bracket, you should never do a Roth conversion. That is just false. What we did for clients, even if they were in a higher tax bracket, for example, in 2022, is convert some of those high growth assets to Roth while the market is down. And when the market rebounds, all that money is tax-free growth. They call this stealing the Roth conversion when Roth conversions are essentially on sale. Number 5, it decreases the impact of the widow's penalty. By doing that conversion today, while you have a larger tax bracket because you're married, you're essentially paying taxes at a lower rate when, God forbid, one day you or your spouse have to file single. This helps decrease the impact of those large RMDs when you file single and your tax bracket shrinks. Lastly, you can position taxes in a way to help the next generation. Many people I talk with don't want to leave a mess to the next generation. I've sat in on countless meetings where I've seen how tax-deferred accounts are now a tax bomb for the person that inherits it. If you leave a $4 million tax-deferred account to the next generation, you've worked so hard but don't want your next generation to pay a 50% tax. And by doing a conversion, this is essentially prepaying some of that inheritance tax for the next generation. So by understanding some of the most critical reasons to even consider Roth conversions, you can start to put yourself in a position to avoid getting crushed in taxes later on because you just didn't know how it would affect you. So let's put all this together. I'm going to share a case study of a couple both age 60 and the exact steps I use to evaluate Roth conversions for them. Okay, so what you're looking at now on my screen is the income plan of Rick and Hannah, not real names, of course, but you can see their projected balance at retirement in January 2025 is going to be about $3 million, right? And they also want to spend around $11,000 per month to afford their lifestyle. So if we zoom in here and we look at the details of their financial picture, they've got investment accounts. They've got $400,000 in a brokerage account, a 401k of around $2 million, and then Hannah has a 403b of around $600,000. And also important, they have around $150,000 in cash. Again, we're just using some assumptions here. We're assuming that they're going to have more of a 75-25 type investment portfolio. And we're going to be more conservative. We're going to assume an average rate of return of around 6% throughout their plan. You can see it says 2.3 here, but we're adding in inflation on top of that of 3.5. So that's the net return. So overall, if we're looking at their tax allocation, which is really important when you're thinking about Roth conversions, they have around 87% of their dollars in tax deferred accounts. And then the taxable account, that's going to be that account that has a little bit more flexibility, and that's going to be around $400,000 or 13% of their total retirement nest egg. And then finally, we can see the Roth bucket has about $0 right now. But next, let's look at their budgeted spending, right? We mentioned that they want to spend around $11,000 net per month. And we're going to start with, hey, what would happen if they didn't do any Roth conversions? How would we start taking income? And the traditional rule of thumb is to start with the brokerage account, then tax deferred, and then tax-free. So we're going to talk about how we're going to overlay Roth conversions over that later. But overall, that would mean $11,000 per month would come from the brokerage account. And if we look at their cash flow just essentially over the course of their retirement, again, if we started with that brokerage account, depleting that fully before we start tapping into those tax deferred accounts, we can see then, that start of retirement, they're going to be able to withdraw around $11,000 per month over time. And you can see the blue and lighter blue shades are going to be when Social Security kicks in for them at different points in the retirement, and things look pretty steady until all of a sudden in around 2039, all of a sudden there's a big jump. And what that jump is those required minimum distributions, right? Your tax deferred account is growing, where the reason why this is going up so much is not because, hey, their spending is getting out of control and they want to spend a lot more money, but it's because of taxes. As you can see here, during the initial years from 2024 to 2038, they're going to pay very, very little in taxes, which might make them feel all nice and warm and fuzzy inside. But then again, 2039, those RMDs are going to start to significantly creep up, and we're going to show how that would impact them shortly here. And the reality is they're going to have to start to reinvest those RMDs because it's way more income than they need. Now, before we look at how doing nothing might cost them, there are 4 questions that I ask myself as a planner that can make a huge difference in analyzing Roth conversions, and I think you should know them as well when you're thinking about Roth conversions for yourself. And these completely can change the trajectory of this type of analysis. Number 1 is, will state tax rates change or will you move? This can save millions of dollars in taxes over your lifetime because some states don't tax retirement income or don't have an income tax at all. The next thing is, what is your current and future filing status? For this situation, they're married filing jointly. Is there an age gap? Like I mentioned earlier, if one of them passes before the other, we're going to have to think about the impact of their tax bracket shrinking in. And then number 3, will their heirs' tax rates be lower or higher? Meaning, are they going to inherit that tax bomb, or are they going to have a low income where it won't really make as much of a difference if we do Roth conversions for them? And lastly, is there any impending tax legislation that will have an impact on this decision? Well, in 2026, the tax law expires, thus raising rates for a lot of people, and that's going to be factored into any sort of analysis you want to do. So after I ask those 4 questions, we're going to put it all together and look at their current tax trajectory, again, if they did nothing. So if we project this income out and inflation adjust tax brackets and future wealth, you can start to see that their lifetime retirement tax bill, if they did nothing, is projected to be about $4 million more if they were just to simply do Roth conversions at the 22% bracket, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the video. But what this tells me is that our intuitions are correct. With these large tax deferred accounts, there's potentially going to be some tax pain down the road. If we go with those traditional rule of thumb that says taxable, tax deferred, and then tax free as far as a withdrawal strategy. we don't want to leave the IRS a $4 million tip. I mean, they'd probably love that, but that's not something that I would want to do if I were in your shoes. So as a planner, what this analysis tells me is that we should start exploring what Roth conversions at the 22% bracket would look like. Again, this is a long-term projection, and this is just a starting point, and you'll see why we'll want to go deeper as we go along here. Most people just stop here, but there's a lot more that goes into this. So once you know how much you want to spend, how you would like to invest, and then longevity, and you can start to answer those 4 questions, you can start to understand the tax bracket that is optimal for you to explore based on your own situation. Okay, so we're gonna start to get tactical with this. What this tells me is we have a good target based on their retirement numbers to hit, but what would this actually look like on their tax return if they retire in 2025? So again, let's start to compare what their taxable income for the first year would look like if they did nothing versus doing Roth conversions. So again, if we look at 2025, if they wanna take around $11,000 per month of net income, starting with the brokerage account, we're gonna estimate that would mean around $68,780 worth of long-term capital gains generated to create that income. Overall, this is what will be generated in order to do the $135,000 worth of gross withdrawals. So let's take a look at the tax year 2025. Again, let's assume that in order to make this $135,000 gross income per year to get to $11,000 per month, they would have to generate long-term gains around $68,000 in 2025. They also have some other taxable income around $2,200 for this year. What that does after we take the standard deduction here of $29,000, that means their taxable income is around $41,000 or so. But because of the preferential treatment of those taxable accounts, the long-term capital gains, they're going to pay $0 in federal taxes. In fact, they're only pay about $852 here. Yeah, $852 here in total state tax. Now here's the problem. Like I mentioned, you might feel warm and fuzzy inside, paying little to no tax early on in retirement, but let's take a look at the ghost of Christmas future. So let's go back and look at some projections, and if we look at the year 2039, when the IRS is going to start forcing those distributions out of those tax-deferred accounts, they're going to have around $202,000 worth of required minimum distributions. And also, you don't want to miss this as well, they're going to have $112,000 of taxable Social Security income. And if we scroll down even more here, we're going to see that of their withdrawals, there's going to be about almost $100,000 of money that they don't need that we're going to have to reinvest because it's way more income that they actually need. And we can see here with the pink, the longer they live, the more this tax snowball starts to add up for them. And that's why we saw earlier they would be giving the IRS potentially over $4 million in a tip by doing nothing. So I think we're clear here why Roth conversions might make a lot of sense for them. So let's go back and see what it would look like in 2025 if we're more tactical and if we decide to do some Roth conversions to fill up the 22% bracket while taking their normal income. So if we want to target that 22% bracket, that would mean a Roth conversion of around $231,000 in 2025. On top of that, we still have that capital gain income because we're taking money from the brokerage account. So if we look at 2025, then again, assuming we try to explore that 22% bracket, again, with a $231,000 Roth conversion, we still have long-term capital gains from generating that income, some other taxable income here. That would mean, after taking the standard deduction, federal tax would be around $52,000. And then also if we add some state tax on top of that, that's around $22,000 in state tax. Now, this is where the art side of planning starts to come in. You've probably heard of risk tolerance when it comes to investing. I call it tax tolerance. Can you tolerate or even afford to pay these taxes a little bit earlier on in retirement? So what happens in practice, we often find that, hey, the science says this is the most optimal amount on paper. We also have to factor in your tolerance for paying that much tax up front. Again, tax is not an option. It's up to you to decide when and how much you pay and at what rate, but it's not all or nothing. So oftentimes we ask ourselves, can we convert a little bit less and still benefit from this? Is that going to be okay? So if we run the analysis again against their just traditional taxable, tax deferred, tax-free rule of thumb, and we do less aggressive Roth conversions at this time, we could still potentially save them a significant amount over their lifetime tax bill and prioritize not doing as much front loading in retirement. We call this finding that Roth conversion sweet spot for you. So again, if we look at tax year 2025, do some less aggressive Roth conversions, and we only convert around $121,000. Again, we saw how that could still make a significant impact. We're still gonna have to pay long-term capital gains. That means your tax bill is now going to be around $23,000 in federal taxes and then only about $11,000 in state taxes compared to the 22% bracket. This is why this is so important to run the math for yourself and understand your own situation, because technology can allow you to run this analysis, but this is where you really have to understand how it works, how to implement it, or find a professional to help you find that sweet spot for you. But we're not done quite yet, because let's say we did target that 12% tax bracket and we were willing to convert around $121,000 in the first year of retirement. There are a few tax gotchas that people are unaware of that can end up costing you if you don't know how the tax code works. So if we look under the hood and we say that, hey, we're going to do those $121,000 Roth conversions, our taxable income is around $178,000, but one of the tax gotchas as I scroll around here is this brown section right here. They call this the net investment income tax. So if we convert more than $121,000, actually convert around $40,000 more, you're going to be hit with that additional 3.8% surtax on the income, which means your tax rate is going to increase. And a second tax gotcha is for those that are on Medicare. And these little dotted lines right here is what we call Medicare IRMA, which basically means that you have to pay extra money in premiums each month because of how much money you make. And no, you don't get any better coverage than your neighbor when you pay more. And finally, a really important one, especially for the people that I work with that want to retire early, is going to be health insurance subsidies. If you're going to go with marketplace insurance, because again, you don't have Medicare yet, your premiums are going to be determined by your modified adjusted gross income, which has a little bit of a special calculation here for the subsidies. But if we compare modified adjusted gross incomes, if we didn't do conversions, we did a 22% conversion, or a 12% conversion in that sweet spot, we can see that the higher your modified adjusted gross income is, the more likely you are to get phased out of any sort of premium credit. So if you did not do conversions, your health insurance would be the cheapest. And as you do more conversions, you'll start to spend more on those monthly premiums. So these are all the adverse things that I look for when I'm starting to do Roth conversions that you need to know about. And sometimes I look at a plan and say, hey, we should probably optimize for health insurance and look at doing conversions a little bit later. Other times I say, hey, you've got a tax bomb waiting for you in the future. We should probably start to reduce that tax deferred balance so you don't get killed in taxes. Even though I get it, it's not going to be as fun to pay the taxes up front. But ultimately, this is a decision for you to make, for you or your advisor that runs this analysis for your own unique situation. So we now understand how much it's going to cost you in taxes, how to find that bracket that is a sweet spot for you to convert, and you are now aware of some of the adverse effects that many people miss. So let's finally talk about how and when to do the actual conversion. So when should you make the conversion? When during the year? And does that actually matter? So most custodians where you hold your money will have a form or some sort of electronic way to complete a conversion. It could be relatively simple, but just know that the conversion counts in whatever year you do the conversion. So if you do a conversion in December 31st of 2024, it's going to go in your 2024 tax return. If you do it on January 1st, 2025, even though you wanted it to count for 2024, it's going to count for 2025. But should you wait until the end of the year to convert? Well, if you run the numbers, actually, earlier in the year is generally better, and that's because you have more dollars to go in the market in that tax-free account. And now markets don't always go up, but on average you get more of a benefit because those accounts tend to rise over time. But there's a framework you need to understand for what is right for you. If you're someone that has predictable income, generally it'll be easier to implement it early in the year because you understand your tax situation and what it will look like, and there's not going to be any surprises, right? But if income is less predictable, you have variable income, that's where I usually want to wait until later in the year in order to make better estimates. Because again, Roth conversions are irrevocable once you make them. You can't recharacterize them. However, if there's a market downturn like we talked about earlier, that could be a great time to convert it. Or some people that do have that variable income take more of a barbell approach where you could do half at the beginning of the year and the rest towards the end of the year when you have a little bit more of a better estimate of what your income might look like. Next, how are you supposed to pay the taxes on this conversion? That's the million-dollar question. In general, I want to go to the place that creates the least additional tax bill for my client. So bank account dollars are generally the most ideal, but I never want you to have to deplete your emergency fund to do that. The next place is going to be the taxable brokerage account, right? Selling the right investment to create maybe a net neutral tax impact is usually how we try to do it. Long-term gain assets, of course, also have a lower tax liability. And then finally, a third option, if you don't have either of the first two options we talked about, is the retirement account itself. Now, this is typically one of the last places you'd want to use, but if the other assets aren't available, you want to use this account anyway, especially if there is a large tax deferred account. Of course, the reason why this is less optimal is because you can't convert as much because much of that money will be withheld for taxes, but it could be much more advantageous than waiting and getting crushed in taxes later on. However, there is a big caveat. And that is that if my client is below 59.5, the conversion oftentimes doesn't make sense because you'd have to pay that 10% withdrawal penalty. So if you're in that camp and you don't have any other assets to pay the taxes, usually this is where the conversion doesn't make sense, because if they do that, there's a chance that their rate they pay will be higher than their future rate, and that just doesn't make sense. And when it comes to paying taxes from option 1 or 2, you can either pay them quarterly, depending on your state or tax situation. Of course, you want to talk with the person who files your tax return first, or you can let your tax grow and get interest and just pay the liability in the following April. Regardless of where you pay, again, the main goal is to pay taxes when your tax rate is the lowest. Okay, so we just went through a lot. So let's review the most important things that you need to remember. Number one, if you haven't heard of it, of course, tax-free growth for life is obviously a fantastic benefit of Roth conversions. But then number two, if you run the numbers and you have some favorable tax rates today compared to the estimates of where you might be in the future, that's when it could be a nice opportunity to lock in this rate with Roth conversions. Number three, tax brackets are like tax buckets, and it's use it or lose it every single year. If we don't fill up those buckets during those lower tax rate years, we lose them. We want to help mitigate of what we can expect in the future when you're in your 70s and you have to take monstrous RMDs. And then lastly, we know what tax rates are today. That's in our control. There are a ton of unknowns, of course, in the future. The best way to view Roth conversions is sort of like tax insurance. You make tax payments so that you're hedging against an unexpected fate down the road. Just like car insurance, you have coverage for any sort of disaster that might come. With Roth conversions, we are having coverage for any future unexpected tax raises as well as your future rate. But just like if you have a beat up Pinto, it may not be for you, or it may not be worth it to insure it. Not everyone should do them. When you buy car insurance, you hope that you never have to use it. But it's nice having a portion of income that we can pull from later on in retirement that is completely tax-free if we need it. But you may have briefly seen a sneak peek of the withdrawal strategy we used earlier in the video, which can add significant value to your retirement planning. So I made a video walking through the different withdrawal strategies, and you can watch that by clicking right here. Once again, this is Matt Calcagno, Certified Financial Planner and Advisor. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, hit that subscribe button so you can hear from me every single week, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.